He started over at 65 years old, rejected 1,009 times. A man with nothing but a fried chicken recipe, an unshakable belief. But he changed the way the world eats. This is the story of Colonel Sanders. Harlan David Sanders was born in the autumn of 1890 in a small wooden house in rural Indiana. Nothing about his birthplace was remarkable. No wealth, no glory, just the scent of soil and survival. But what made Harlan different was that he never really had a childhood. At the age of just 5, he became a man. His father, the sole breadwinner of the family, died suddenly from a fever after a long day of farming. In an instant, the world fell silent. His mother, now a widow with 3 young children, was forced to work long hours at a tomato cannery just to put food on the table. That left young Harlan in charge of the house, cooking, chopping wood, tending to his younger siblings, and keeping the home intact. He was barely tall enough to reach the stove, yet every day he stood there stirring pots of beans and potatoes with trembling hands and a determined heart. While other boys were learning how to read and write, Harlan was learning how to survive. There was no space for toys, no time for games, no luxury for dreams. Each meal he cooked wasn't just dinner, it was an act of survival. Every pot he scrubbed, every crying sibling he calmed, every cold night he tucked himself under a thin blanket. These were the bricks that built the man he would become. He did try school, but poverty didn't wait for permission. By 7th grade, he had to drop out completely. Not because he was lazy, not because he didn't care, but because life demanded his hands more than it wanted his homework. From that point on, Harlan took on whatever work he could find. He painted fences, farmed other people's land, worked in horse stables, cleaned cemeteries. Whatever put a coin in his hand, whatever put bread in the mouths of his family. Each job taught him something, not about profit, but about pain, about persistence. He learned that no one was coming to save him, that hard work wasn't always rewarded, but quitting guaranteed nothing. When asked, many years later, about his childhood, Sanders simply replied, "I became a man when I was 6." By the time Harlan turned 16, he had already lived more lives than most men twice his age. But instead of slowing down, life only became more restless. With no formal education, no connections, and no guidance, Harlan jumped from one job to another, chasing survival like a man trying to outrun the tide. He worked on farms, drove mule carts, became a railroad worker, and even tried his hand as a streetcar conductor. Each time he hoped it would last. Each time it didn't. He once joined the U.S. Army by lying about his age, thinking uniform and duty might bring him stability. But even the Army wasn't his destiny. He was honorably discharged after just a year. And so began another chapter of drift and grind. In Alabama, he studied law by correspondence and briefly became a practicing lawyer. It was a moment of pride until a courtroom fistfight with a client ended his legal career abruptly. Fired, disgraced, start over. He became an insurance salesman, fired. A steamboat operator, failed. A railroad fireman, injured. He tried selling tires, running gas stations, selling life insurance again. Everything he touched seemed to fall apart. But Harlan wasn't lazy. He wasn't incompetent. He was perhaps just ahead of his time, born into a world not yet ready for his kind of stubbornness. There were moments where he thought of quitting, of settling, but something inside refused. Maybe it was pride, maybe hunger, maybe the echo of his father's absence reminding him that he had no one to fall back on. By his early 40s, Harlan Sanders had worked over a dozen different jobs, started multiple failed businesses, and had nothing to show for it but burnt hands, aching joints, and a heart still full of fire. One of the few things that stuck with him through the years was his ability to cook. Back in his mother's kitchen, he had learned how to season food, how to stretch a meal, how to make something hearty from nearly nothing. And no matter where he went, people remembered, that guy can cook. It wasn't fine dining, it was comfort. Fried chicken that made you forget your troubles. Gravy that hugged your soul. Food that reminded people of home, even if they didn't have one. He didn't know it yet, but buried under all his failures was the seed of his future. It just hadn't taken root yet, because greatness doesn't always arrive in a straight line. Sometimes it stumbles in the dark, bruised, bloodied, and tired, but still moving forward. And Colonel Sanders was still moving forward. By the time Harlan Sanders reached his 40s, most men around him had settled, if not for success, then for silence. But Sanders still had fire. It smoldered behind his tired eyes, beneath his weathered hands. And when opportunity refused to knock, he decided to build his own door. That door was a gas station. In the small town of Corbin, Kentucky, Harlan leased a Shell service station off a dusty highway. It wasn't much, just a pump, a sign, and a stretch of two-lane road that barely saw traffic. But Harlan had something most men didn't: relentless grit and a cast-iron skillet. He began serving food to hungry travelers out of the back of the station. Not fancy meals, just what he knew: country ham, biscuits, mashed potatoes, and of course, fried chicken. His fried chicken wasn't like others. It wasn't greasy, it wasn't dry. It was seasoned perfectly. Crispy on the outside, juicy on the inside. He mixed spices by instinct, like a painter blends color, a little heat, a little warmth, a whisper of sweetness. 11 herbs and spices. That was his secret. But this was no overnight miracle. He burned through countless batches, tried dozens of combinations, listened to feedback, tweaked again. He was failing in small ways every single day, but never the same way twice. Eventually, he built a small restaurant next to the gas station called Sanders Court and Cafe. It wasn't glamorous, but it was real. Real food, real people, real hard-earned money. The locals came, then people from further away. Soon, it wasn't just a gas stop. It was a destination. People were driving miles for a plate of that chicken. In 1935, the governor of Kentucky heard of Sanders' success and honored him with the title Colonel for his contribution to Southern cuisine and hospitality. It was a name. But for Sanders, it was more than that. It was an identity he embraced. Not for vanity, but because it reminded him of everything he had fought through to get here. He started wearing the white suit, the black string tie, the neatly trimmed goatee. He became Colonel Sanders, not as a character, but as a man who had finally stepped into his own legacy. But fate, as always, wasn't done testing him. Just when things were going well, a new highway was built, bypassing his restaurant entirely. The traffic that fed his business vanished overnight. Within months, Sanders Court was forced to close. All that time, all that effort, gone. Most would call that the end of the road. But for Harlan Sanders, it was just another bend in it, because what he had now was something no one could take away. A recipe, a reputation, a dream. He packed up his pressure fryer, his bag of spices, and his suit. And at 65 years old, he hit the road again. 65 years old. Most people at that age retire, rest, and reflect. But not Harlan Sanders. He had no retirement fund, no savings. His restaurant was gone. All he had left were a pressure cooker, a bag of flour mixed with 11 herbs and spices, and an idea that hadn't died yet. So he ironed his white suit, tied his black ribbon tie, and began a journey no one could have predicted. A door-to-door mission to bring his chicken to the world. He drove across states in his beat-up car, sometimes sleeping in the back seat, eating crackers and cold beans, wearing the same suit day after day. He would walk into restaurants and diners, ask to speak to the owner and say, "Let me cook you some chicken. If you like it, let's talk business." Most looked at him like he was crazy. Some laughed in his face. Others didn't even let him finish his pitch. But he kept going. Door 1. No thanks. Door 14. We already have fried chicken. Door 87. You're too old to be doing this. Door 126. Not interested. Door 340 slammed shut. He knocked on 1009 doors, and 1009 times he was rejected. Imagine that, being told no over 1,000 times after you've lost everything. Most people would give up after 10. Some would hold on until 100. But 1,000? Sanders didn't count the rejections as failures. He counted them as process. Each no brought him one step closer to the yes that would change everything. And then door 1010 opened. A small restaurant owner agreed to try his chicken. Then another. Then 5. Then 10. Colonel Sanders started licensing his recipe for 5 cents per chicken sold. That's right, 5 cents. It wasn't about the money. It was about building something lasting, something that could live on even when he couldn't. What began as a battered man in a white suit turned into a small franchise, then a bigger one. And within a few years, Kentucky Fried Chicken was born. He didn't invent chicken. He didn't invent cooking. But he invented belief in himself, in perseverance, in the idea that no dream is too old to chase. And every time you see that white suit, that smiling face, that bucket of chicken, remember, behind it stands a man who knocked 1009 times and never gave up. By the time Harlan Sanders was in his 70s, something incredible had happened. The man who once slept in the back of his car was now traveling across America by plane. The man who once begged for people to try his chicken was now appearing on television, shaking hands with governors, smiling on posters beside buckets of fried chicken with his name on it. Kentucky Fried Chicken. But don't be mistaken. His success didn't come in gold. It came in grease-stained aprons, in late nights driving across state lines, and thousands of pieces of chicken cooked to perfection by people he personally trained. Colonel Sanders didn't just license a recipe, he trained each restaurant owner himself. He would show up unannounced at diners and say, "How's the chicken today?" If it wasn't up to standard, he wasn't shy about letting them know. He wasn't a businessman in a suit with a portfolio. He was the business. By 1964, there were over 600 KFC franchises across the United States and Canada. Sanders was nearly 74 years old when he sold the company for $2 million, a massive sum at the time. But even after selling, he remained its brand ambassador, continuing to travel, appear in commercials, and shake the hands of KFC employees from Kentucky to Tokyo. Why? Because this wasn't just a business to him. It was redemption. It was the proof that it's never too late to matter. He would walk into kitchens and say, "Make it the way I made it in Corbin." And if the cooks asked why, he'd simply reply, "Because I had nothing to lose when I made it back then, and nothing to hide either." In an age when people wanted fast, he insisted on flavor. When people asked for shortcuts, he pointed to the pressure cooker he'd carried with him across thousands of miles. And when interviewers asked what motivated him after all the rejection, he answered, "I just couldn't die before proving I was right." His white suit became a symbol not of wealth, but of identity, of a man who had been broken, dismissed, and underestimated his whole life, only to rise by the sheer force of will. And people didn't just come for the chicken. They came to believe. To believe that maybe, just maybe, failure isn't the opposite of success. It's the road to it. Most men slow down in their 70s. Colonel Sanders didn't know how. Even after selling KFC, even after making his millions, even after becoming a global icon with his smiling face on hundreds of storefronts, he kept going. He traveled over 250,000 miles a year, visiting franchises, shaking hands with kitchen workers, greeting customers, checking the quality of the gravy and the crispiness of the chicken, just like he did in Corbin. He didn't need to. He wasn't required to. He wanted to. Because every restaurant with his name on it wasn't just a store, it was a piece of his soul. At 75, he was on magazine covers. At 80, he was filming commercials. At 85, he was still standing in kitchens, making sure the spice blend was just right. He told reporters, "I may be old, but I'm not done." He would wake up early, still iron his white suit, still tie that black ribbon, still smooth down his snow-white goatee before heading out the door. Because to him, success didn't mean stepping back. It meant stepping up every single day. And when health problems came, fatigue, arthritis, the slow wear of time, he didn't complain. He just moved slower, but never stopped. People often asked him, "Colonel, what kept you going? After all the failures, after all the years?" He would smile, tap his cane, and say, "I never knew when to quit. That's what saved me." He began donating to children's hospitals. He funded scholarships. He would walk into a room full of college students and tell them, "If you believe you're too old, you're wrong. If you think it's too late, it's not." He didn't preach. He lived it. Every wrinkle on his face was a line in a story he never stopped telling. Colonel Sanders became more than a man. He became a symbol of perseverance, of starting over, of purpose born out of pain. Not everyone knew his full story, but when they saw that white suit, they felt something. Not hunger, not curiosity, but hope. Because if a man could fail for 60 years and still rise in the 61st, then maybe so could we. The final years of Colonel Sanders' life weren't spent in luxury. They were spent in purpose. He no longer owned Kentucky Fried Chicken. He didn't sit on the board, didn't control the finances, didn't sign the checks, but everyone knew KFC was still his. Not in contracts, but in spirit. He still visited restaurants, unannounced. He still tasted the gravy, and if it was too thin, he'd say so. He still reminded young managers, "Don't cut corners, I didn't." Even as his body grew weaker, his voice stayed strong. He was asked once during a TV interview, "Do you ever regret starting so late?" He laughed. "No, sir," he said. "Better late than never at all." Colonel Harlan Sanders passed away on December 16, 1980. He was 90 years old. The man who was once fired from every job he tried, the man who lost his restaurant to a highway, the man who was rejected 1,009 times, was now mourned by millions around the world. Flags in Kentucky flew at half-staff. Over 1,000 KFC franchises went silent for a moment in tribute. Newspapers didn't just report his death, they celebrated his life. But more powerful than all the ceremonies was the legacy left behind. It wasn't just the recipe. It wasn't just the brand. It wasn't even the chicken. It was the message. You are never too old. You are never too late. And failure is just a beginning in disguise. Today, people walk into KFC and see a smiling man in a white suit on a bucket. Most just see a logo. But some who know the real story, see something else. They see a man who refused to quit, who spent 6 decades failing, and still believed he could change the world. And the truth is, he did. Not just with chicken, but with courage.